Hello, welcome to a presentation by Vigilant Fire Service Training, LLC. This lesson is going to be fireground operations, strategy, tactics, and tasks. Our terminal objective for this lesson is, after this lesson, the firefighter will be able to define strategy, tactic, and tasks, as well as describe their relationship to each other. Our enabling objectives for this lesson will be, following the lesson, the firefighter will be able to define 3 fireground strategies. List 5 primary tactics. List 5 secondary tactics. Identify 3 tasks associated with each tactic, and describe how the selection of the tasks is related to the strategy. So we're talking about the fireground here. When we're talking about the fireground, what is the goal on our fireground? So just think to yourself and answer the question in your own head. What is the goal of every fireground? Well, our definition here is the goal of the fireground is to safely mitigate any given emergency by deploying an effective procedure that uses all available resources in an efficient manner. Now, nobody expects anyone to remember this definition at 2 o'clock in the morning when we're responding to a house fire with reported people trapped. However, if we can take 3 things out of this definition and work on those 3 things, those 3 highlighted things, we would pull out safe, effective, and efficient. Okay, so the goal of our fireground is to remain safe while we mitigate the situation effectively and use our manpower efficiently. So we remain safe, effective, and efficient. This is what we call the fireground trinity: safe, effective, and efficient fireground operations. Now, these 3 work in conjunction with each other and all support each other in the same manner that each is supported. We can be safe on the fireground without being effective or efficient. That's real easy. We do nothing. We can also be effective without being safe. When we're effective without being safe, it's no longer efficient though. We totally lose our efficiency. Nobody's working with an abundance of manpower. Therefore, if we are working effectively without being safe, we lose our efficiency because we're going to lose somebody through injury. And when we lose one firefighter through injury, how many firefighters do we actually lose? Obviously, we've lost the one who's involved in the injury. But we've also lost the crew that's surrounding that firefighter's partners, because they have to aid the firefighter who is now injured. So now we've lost an entire company, not to mention that we have to put a company into service to replace the company that's lost, along with another company to aid in the rescue, such as a RIC or a FAST team. So how many people did we actually lose when we lose one firefighter from operating effectively without being safe? Operating safe, effective, and efficient is tough. If we were to take a gun and shoot at this as a target, we could take each one of these independent circles and say that's going to be our target. So how hard is it to shoot a rifle, say from 50 yards, and hit the target circle of the word safe? Relatively easy. We could probably hit that target. Now what I want us to think about is hitting that area that we see shaded between safe and effective. It gets a little bit harder. But the sweet spot of the fireground trinity is operating in a safe, effective, and efficient manner. And that sweet spot where those circles all come together is right in the middle, and it's the smallest, hardest spot to hit. How would we do that if we were trying to learn how to shoot a rifle to hit this target? Well, we would do it through training and repetitive motion, repetitive actions. So let's talk about common language, just so we can get everyone on the same wavelength, so that everyone understands exactly what language we're talking about. This lesson represents the basis for what the Vigilant Fire Service training methodology is built upon. So it's very critical at this point that we understand a common language between everyone. The strategy, tactics, and tasks, are those 3 separate entities in your mind? Or are they words that represent roughly the same thing in your mind? From a vigilant standpoint, when we talk about the words strategy, tactics, and tasks, they are three completely separate words. They are three individual entities of their own. And this is how we like to look at it. We can link up strategy with safe fireground operations. Tactics is what makes us effective on the fireground. And individually assigned tasks is how we become efficient on the fireground. If we look at this with a football analogy, we can think about strategy as being a high-level game plan. It is the overall game plan. Strategy being a game plan, much like here we can see in this slide where the Buffalo Bills are taking on the San Diego Chargers. The Bills have a game plan of how they're going to operate overall. What are the overall goals of mitigating this football game? That's our game plan. That's strategy. Now, tactic, that's more of a single procedure. All right, for promoting a desired result is what the slide tells us. But think about it with the football analogy, is that's being an individual play. Okay, so our overall game plan is, hey, we want to score more than they do. How do we do that? Well, on defense, we stop them from scoring, and on offense, we do tactics such as individual plays in an attempt to move the football forward and score a touchdown. In this case, the tactic is a single play, and this play is called a bootleg, where the quarterback's going to kick out and run around the end. However, for that bootleg play to work, okay, we're going to need a couple of tasks, and tasks are identified by the most essential piece of the job, the smallest little piece of work that can happen. And in this case, when we're talking about the football analogy, it's real easy. Somebody's got to block and somebody's going to run. So here we see the guard kicking out. He's going to come around the end and make sure that the quarterback has an open path to the end zone. That's what strategy, tactics, and tasks looks like in a quick analogy. So strategy. Our strategy is our game plan. It's the overall plan for how the fireground is going to operate. Okay? It's based on a risk assessment that we perform. What is our risk assessment? Our risk assessment is we risk a lot to save a lot. We risk a little to save nothing. Okay? We risk nothing to save nothing. And based on that risk strategy, based on that risk assessment, we come up with a strategy that keeps us safe on the fireground. And we do that by choosing typically one of three modes of operation. Either we're going to be offensive, defensive, or transitional. When we are in the offensive strategy, it's an aggressive interior operation. We're going to meet the fire where the fire lives. This is selected when we have a potential of reward that equals the risk. We all know it's extremely risky to enter a burning building. Okay, so when we do that, when we enter the building, we need to have a reward that equals what we could potentially give up. And when we think about risk, that's how we should be thinking about it. We should be thinking about risk as something we're willing to give up in every single situation. And when we think about reward, the reward needs to be what we're willing to take on for giving up. Defensive, obviously, is way less aggressive than an interior attack. This is when we take operations on the outside to surround and drown. We create a perimeter, stay behind the perimeter, and just basically keep ourselves safe while we try to mitigate the situation to the best potential. Reality, as we know, is not always black and white. It's not very obvious to us on every single situation that we get into whether or not we should be in an offensive mode or a defensive mode. Sometimes we have a great potential for a reward, but the risk is too great to live up to the potential for the reward. In that case, we have to take an action to mitigate the risk that we face so we can equal the potential for the reward that we are going to be getting out of the situation. And that's what we call a transitional attack. Obviously, in this situation, our turnout gear is not made to walk through a wall of fire. However, we could have a tenable living situation inside of this bedroom on the A-B corner of this house. Entering it would be too much risk to us, but there is a potential for reward in this. What do? We have to take some of the risk away by knocking the fire down from the outside and then making entry through the same way that we've knocked the fire down. Now, tactics. Tactics, as we have said, is how we become effective on the fire ground. It's what makes us effective on the fire ground. It's what gets the work done. It's what makes the scene look better after we arrive than it did before we got on scene. Okay, so tactics, those are procedures for promoting that desired result. What is the desired result we're looking for? It's a skillful way of doing something or making something happen, and it's the means by which the strategy is carried out. And we have a bunch of them. We do search tactics. We have ventilation tactics, obviously rescue tactics, suppression, and if we're going to be suppressing the fire, we need to perform a water supply tactic. Tactics are broken up into two separate categories, primary and secondary, with each category containing 5 tactics each. Our primary tactics, as the title suggests, should be assigned before the secondary tactics. However, that's not an always. Our primary tactics that need to happen at every single fire ground are suppression, search, ventilation, water supply, and backup suppression. These 5 core tactics need to take place at every single structure fire that we respond to. Now, that's not always going to be in this order. That order will be prioritized due to the situation that you arrive on scene with. However, every fire that we respond to has to be put out through some form of suppression. Every fire that we go to, we have to perform a search for potential victims. And that's whether we have a report of victims or a report of everyone out of the building. Every single fire that we go to is going to be ventilated, whether we are controlling the ventilation or the ventilation is happening naturally. Ventilation is a tactic that needs to be addressed. If we're putting water on the fire by means of any form of suppression you can think of, we're going to have to get a water supply. When we're putting water on the fire via any means that you can think of, we have to back that suppression up. Those are our primary tactics. Secondary tactics, again, should typically be performed once all the primary tactics have been assigned. However, that's not always the case. There may be a time when we might have to control utilities before we can perform suppression. But our secondary tactics, generally speaking, will be assigned after our primary tactics. So secondarily, what we have to do is obviously perform a secondary search, obtain a secondary water supply, control our utilities, perform an active extension investigation, and some form of salvage and overhaul. So you may have attended a lecture or read an article in a trade magazine that has told you before that when we change our strategy, we must change our tactics. And if you go back to a couple of slides previous to this, we said it's important that we understand what language is and understand each other's language as we speak. What we're about to tell you is that tactics remain the same regardless of strategy. Now you might say that goes against everything you've read or heard. However, let me explain it to you this way. We are trying to get across a new language that we all understand, where strategy, tactics, and tasks are 3 completely different things. When we hear terms like when we change our strategy, we must change our tactics, people are referring to tactics in that manner as tasks. With our language, the way that we're putting across strategy, tactics, and tasks, you must understand that tactics will remain the same on every single fire ground you go to because they are suppression, search, ventilation, water supply, and backup suppression. Those are our tactics. What will change when we change our strategy, however, is our tasks. Tactical assigned tasks will change as strategy selection changes. Tasks are our smallest piece of work on the fire ground, our smallest defined piece of work. Okay? It's typically assigned to a person, or in our case, a company. They're clearly defined small pieces of work that are often short or limited in duration. And it's what we assign or expect of a company or a pair of firefighters. You'll notice that here, our pictures are the same exact pictures from the tactics slide. However, in these pictures, instead of showing you search, we're showing you a search via a hose line. Instead of showing you suppression, we're showing you suppression through a master stream application. Tasks are the defined, specific portion of a tactic. That's what tasks are. And when we look at a couple of these, you'll understand more. So suppression would be the tactic. And you can probably in your head name some suppression tasks. When we're talking about suppression, we might be sitting on a looped 2.5. An exterior defensive strategy. The tactic is suppression, and we're applying water from the outside with a play pipe. Or maybe we're operating a deck gun with a master stream. Or maybe it is that offensive strategy where we're stretching interior with a hand line 1 3/4 to the seat of the fire. How about search? Search is a tactic, but there are individual tasks of that search. Name some. Well, we could just have a simple traditional orientated search where we're searching off of a wall, or maybe searching off of a hose line that was stretched or that we had stretched. Or maybe we're in an auditorium or a school or a gymnasium and the area is large and we have to search via rope. A large area search via rope is a task of the tactic search. Or maybe we've pulled up and we have a screaming mother on the sidewalk saying, "My baby is in the bedroom." That's a vent enter search task of the tactic search. Ventilation. Again, ventilation being the tactic. What are some tasks of ventilation? We perform ventilation several different ways on the fire ground. Hydraulic, positive pressure, or breaking a window for horizontal. You may have noticed that when we listed our 5 primary tactics, forcible entry wasn't one of them. We specifically left out forcible entry because forcible entry, in its nature, is ventilation. And that's how we want you to consider that from here forward. Ventilation is any opening where we are allowing fresh air to enter the compartment. How about water supply? Water supply is a tactic, but there are several tasks. And if you live in a rural area, there are many tasks of the tactic water supply. Here are just a few. Obviously, we can make a municipal fire hydrant where the water source is municipal and comes from a pipe underground. We can nurse between 2 units, or we can draft from a static source. These are all separate tasks of the tactic water supply. Now, the assigned tactical task must match our strategy, and that's where we become safe, effective, and efficient. In this case, what we've done is we selected a strategy that is defensive. Our tactic has to remain suppression, whether it's defensive, offensive, or transition. We have to perform 5 primary tactics, but our task must match that strategy. So in other words, if we're defensive and we've been assigned the tactic suppression, our application of that suppression must be from a safe distance outside the building. When we talk about suppression and how each one of these tactics equals the strategy, when we're offensive with suppression, we can perform an aggressive interior stretch to the seat of the fire. That would be our task, stretching a line to the seat of the fire. When we go defensive strategy, it's an application of a master stream from outside of the collapse zone. And in our transitional, we would knock the main body of fire down from an exterior position and then aggressively stretch to the interior seat of the fire. Search in the offensive strategy, that's the aggressive thermal imaging camera led search, where we're going room to room looking for victims who are still viable. Defensive strategy, we still have to perform some form of search, but in this case it might be evacuation of the exposure occupancies, or it might be doing a 360 of the exterior of the building. In a transitional selected strategy, this is where our vent enter search comes in, the most risky of all search tasks is vent enter search. We use that sparingly, typically in a transitional form. Ventilation, when we're in the offensive, it might be a coordinated breaking of windows to support suppression. Defensively, we might have to create exterior openings for suppression access. And in transitional, it might be simply controlling the door to limit the introduction of fresh air, to slow the fire spread. So as you can see, strategy, tactics, and tasks is all about language. It's all about understanding that strategy is the overall selection of the mode to keep us safe on the fire ground. Our tactics have to remain the same for every fire ground that we go on, because that's what makes us effective. And if we're going to be efficient at this job, we have to have individually assigned tasks that support the tactic operating in the mode of strategy to keep us safe. So that concludes our lesson. Your training administrator hopefully has given you a short quiz after this lesson. We promise you the quiz is not too bad. So complete the quiz and return it to your training administrator, and we'll talk to you in our next lesson. Thank you for choosing Vigilant.